Welcome back. In this session, we are going to start building our data flow. So to do that, let's go to the Author tab and click on three dots. Then select New Data Flow. Once your new data flow appear on canvas, you will get a toggle button on top called Data Flow Debug. Make sure you should on it, as we are going to test our data flow while doing the transformation. If we will not turn this, then we are not able to run our transformation in debug mode. So you must be asking, why we are not able to run in debug mode? That is because without this toggle on, Azure don't come to know where you want compute or not. Once you turn on, then you will get this configuration window where we will get the option to select integration runtime. So, before we start building that, let's turn on the debug. So, you just have to click in there to turn it on. And select the default integration runtime. That should be enough for what we are doing. That gives us a Spark cluster, which is for course. So, let's click OK. But if you wanted a bigger cluster for your debug, you'll have to create a new integration runtime with a bigger default cluster. So, I'll quickly show you where that is. So, you can go into the Manage button here, and then if you come into Integration Runtimes, you can click Create a new integration runtime with the Spark cluster. So, I'll show you the default one. The default one. If you expand that one, and you'll see that actually we got a compute type of general purpose, and we got 4 driver nodes and 4 driver cores and 4 work cores actually. And the time to live is 0 minutes. What that means is actually your Spark cluster will be turned off after 0 minutes of inactivity. So, let's close that one. Go back to our other author screen again. We are back in our canvas, and you are quite familiar with this screen. This is very similar to the pipeline screen. Let's name our data flow first. And I'm going to call mine as DF Transform Cases and Deaths. Once you've done that, the first thing you do always is to create a source. So, you can click Add Source to create a source. We need at least one source transformation and a sync transformation in each of the data flows. Otherwise, it'll be invalid. But you can have as many sources as you like. But mandatory is at least one. Data is flowing through the data flow are called stream. So, we need to name our stream. I'm going to call this one as Cases and Death Source. Now we need to decide whether to keep the source transformation inside a Data Factory dataset, which we've got here. Some of those are to keep it within the source transformation itself. If you want to keep the dataset inside the Data Factory, then you can create a dataset and then refer to that here. You choose dataset in here, and then you can choose one of the datasets or create a new one. But if you wanted to keep it local to the source transformation, then you can choose one of those inline ones. But there are some limitations. Let me show you which ones that are available at the moment. As you can see here, source type supported in a data flow, or these ones, the blob stores and data lakes, Gen 2, Gen 1, and all of those. But the dataset support is available for most of those, but the inline support is only available for a few of them. The one we've got currently is our delimited text, which is our CSV file. So, we will have to use a dataset, but I just want to make sure that you understand actually you've got this inline option as well. Let me go back here. Generally, the decision I make on whether to use a dataset or inline is based on a few factors. Number 1, actually, whether that is supported or not for the type of source I have got. And the other thing I normally look at is actually whether I want to use that data set in any of my other transformations. If that's the case, it's easier to create a data set and then reuse it everywhere. And I don't have to define anything here. And also, whether my data set is well known. So, I have a fixed schema and I know I understand the data set really well. In that case, actually that goes in as a dataset. Otherwise, I'll go for inline. So, in this case, we want a dataset. So, let's create one. So, I'm going to click New, and we want to pick Data Lake Storage Gen 2. And click Continue. And our file we know is a delimited text, and click Continue. And then we want to name our dataset. So, I'm going to call this one as DF Raw Cases and Deaths. Okay, let's pick the link service. The data lake link service is this one. And then we want to pick our file. So, we want to go to raw of the CDC. And the dataset we want to pick is the Cases and Death CSV. So, we're not going to use our sample file. I'll show you where to use the sample file. But our data flow needs to have this one. So, let's click OK. And we know that our file has a header, and let's import the schema from the file as well, actually because our schema is well known at this stage. So, let's click OK, and the dataset is now created. You may have realized that I created the dataset by going here, but it still appears here. In the past, we've used the dataset action here to create a new dataset, but the other way of creating a dataset is coming into the data flow and then clicking new from here as well. So, if you test the connection, let's make sure that that works. That should be fine. Okay, the connection's now successful. Let's look at the other options here. This is an interesting one, allow schema drift. This is very useful if you expect your source data to change often. If you take this one, what that does is actually, even if there is a new column being added to the dataset, data flow will just flow that through to the sink without you having to make any code changes. But if you don't do that, then actually won't be carried through. It'll only be the fixed schema you've already specified. But for the new columns or any changes being made to the source data, if you want data flow to infer the column types, then you take that one. If you don't take it, then everything that is being added or inferred will be of type string. The next one we got here is validate schema. When you tick that one, if your data doesn't satisfy the dataset schema specified, then it'll fail. In order to see the dataset schema, you can go to the dataset and then you can see the schema here. We expect the file to have this structure, but in case if there is an additional column and you take this valid schema, then it'll fail validation. Skip line count. Say if you specify a number of records to skip within your file, then it'll do that. And sampling, you've got enabled and disabled. If you enable the sampling, data flow will pick a sample set of data to flow through the system. When you're testing, you may want to enable it so that you can test it. But you might be wondering actually why we created a sample file for ourselves. The reason being is if you click enable here, data flow will randomly sample some data. But in our case, I wanted to show you exactly what happens with one country being outside of Europe and another country within Europe. And I want to show you everything. So, I want to be in charge of the sampling as opposed to leaving it to data flow. That brings us to the topic of where do we use the sample file we created. I want to use that within our debug. If I click on debug settings, then you see actually how many records are being sampled. It's 1000 at the moment, but we know that we had 1192 in our file. I want all of that data to flow through so that I can see everything. I'm going to just set it to 2000. And also, you can specify a sample file because our data set itself is referring to our actual file. We want to specify a sample file for our debug. Let's click on that one and then we can go to again our data lake and pick the sample file we created. ECDC, and then it'll be the UK India only. What you're seeing here is for debugging purposes we are going to use the sample file. But in order to do the actual execution of the data flow, we'll be using the full file. You don't have to make any kind of changes to the code once you've tested it. So, that is everything on the source settings. Let's have a look at the source options. This will be very familiar to you because this is exactly the same as you see within your copy activity. So, the most of these are applicable for a file because our source is a file, but if you had a SQL database or a Parquet file, for example, that'll be vastly different. A couple of things to notice here. You can delete the file once the data flow has succeeded by clicking here, or you can move it into another folder to archive the file as well. And you can pick up the last files based on the last modified date. So, you could say gimme everything which is changed within today. And I don't want to process the files which are older than that. And projection, basically once you've created your data set, everything was defined as a string as we saw. So, that's what you're seeing here. But within the data flow, if you want to deal with the actual data types, then you can detect the data type or change it manually yourself. For example, I can change, we know that the date is a date, so I can change that to a date, but let me put it back to string. And you can also use the detect data type to ask Data Factory to infer the schema based on the sample data. If you click on that one, it'll identify the data types for each of the columns based on the data, and then it'll give you that. Okay. As you can see here, we got population now turned into an integer and daily count is an integer and rate is a date and data preview. Once you've got the debug on, you can also preview the data. If I click refresh, it'll bring the data back from our file. Yeah, as you can see here, we got the data brought back from our file. This is what we expected. This is quite useful when you are doing transformations and you want to see the results as you go along. This is brought back 1,192 records. So, it's all of the records because we specified our debug settings 2,000 records to bring back. So, that is everything about the source transformation. In the next session, we look at a filter transformation so that we can take only the data related to the continent Europe forward. See you then.